PPR fantasy football rankings. That's all you need to know. Let's get into it. Started off with Justin Jefferson at 1. If you are looking at Justin Jefferson through the first 3 years of his NFL career, the man only gets better. Wide receiver 11 as a rookie, wide receiver 4 as a second-year player, wide receiver 2 in year 3. The man is now stepping into his prime. Yes, our next few players have been maybe a little more productive over the past 3 seasons, but if you're going to look at Justin Jefferson, given the age that he was able to accomplish these seasons at, you have to assume that it's only a matter of time until Justin Jefferson cements himself as the unquestioned alpha wide receiver for the entire NFL. Now, what I'm going to be a little concerned about will be the overall target share that Justin Jefferson may see this next season. With the addition of both TJ Hawkinson as well as Jordan Addison, you can assume that Justin Jefferson most likely will not get back to the 27% team target share that he had back when he was a second-year player, and instead, it's probably going to be closer to what we saw this past season, right? Where he's hovering around 26%. But even if the targets go down just a little bit and he doesn't average 11 targets a game, it's still going to be fine, because with the addition of Hawkinson and Addison, hopefully taking more attention from the opposing defensive coordinator, that could actually boost the efficiency of Justin Jefferson. That's personally what I'm expecting. And all you have to see for a massive Justin Jefferson explosion, even bigger than what we've had previously, is for his touchdown rate to go to the other end of the spectrum. We know touchdown rate is going to be the most volatile statistic for wide receivers in fantasy, and instead we should be focusing in on yards per route run, intended air yards, and honestly, just their overall fantasy points. And those are going to be more predictive season after season, and we can assume random fluctuations with how often they score touchdowns. Well, if we see the touchdown rate from Justin Jefferson go from about 4.5% up to 8%, up to 9%, this could allow Justin Jefferson to put up one of the best wide receiver seasons we've ever seen in fantasy football. Now, going over to our second guy here, Jamar Chase. While I understand a lot of people are upset because they drafted Jamar Chase, and Jamar Chase this past year wasn't necessarily phenomenal, right? I mean, you actually saw the touchdown rate for Jamar Chase go down from about 10% down to 6.7%, like we were talking about. Touchdown rate extremely volatile from a week-to-week, season-to-season standpoint. And Jamar Chase missed time. Both of those are the reasons why people make the argument that maybe Jamar Chase doesn't belong up in this tier. I'm not buying that. If you're looking at the target share you had from Jamar Chase this past season, he was at 31%. When Joe Burrow drops back to pass, there is about a 31% chance that he is throwing the ball to Jamar Chase. To have that level of target share from a quarterback as good as Joe Burrow is almost impossible to find. This is a player going into year 3. If he follows the same natural trajectory that we saw from Justin Jefferson, he's only going to continue to improve. He's in an elite level offense. He's the younger option. I think you have to have Chase in this same tier with Jefferson. Now, our third guy actually has some allegations. He actually has the league looking into him. Tyreek Hill. Now, my initial read on the situation, and of course, I'm an idiot. You shouldn't just trust me, but sounds like what's going on does not matter at all off the field, and Tyreek Hill is going to play 17 games this next season. I personally am not worried about Tyreek Hill missing time. Now, if you are, or if we get more news, trust me, we'll be updating these rankings very soon when more news comes out. But if I'm looking at Tyreek Hill, this is a wide receiver that goes over to Miami and is just as good as what you saw in Kansas City. Now, if you're looking at the intended air yards per game, 131. The man is a deep threat. The man is getting volume, 3.3 yards per route run at the very top of the NFL this past season. Now, the touchdown rate was actually a little bit lower. It was down there at 4%, but very similar to what we were discussing when it comes to Justin Jefferson. This touchdown rate is extremely volatile on a year-to-year standpoint, and you may actually see a spike with Tyreek Hill's touchdown rate going into this next season, which could give him an even better year in fantasy than what we just saw. And honestly, I think it's almost likely that we get a better season, because while Tyreek Hill was able to average 100 receiving yards on a per game basis this past year, you have to look at the context behind this, in that you had 4 games with no Tua for Tyreek Hill this past season. And in those 4 games, Tyreek Hill averaged 75.5 receiving yards per game. Tyreek Hill had 0 receiving touchdowns. Tyreek Hill only averaged about 15.5 fantasy points per game, which is still a wide receiver one, but by no means is it a true elite level option. But in the games where Tua played, and y'all know my opinion on Tua, I think he's a phenomenal quarterback. Tyreek Hill averaged 21.5 points per game. Tyreek Hill averaged 108 receiving yards on a per game basis. Tua's going to play, presumably the entire season this next year. So I'm going to have Tyreek at 3. Now, if you're going to go over to Cooper Kupp, yes, if you look at our chart here, Kupp has back-to-back seasons as the wide receiver 1 from a fantasy points per game perspective. And Cooper Kupp actually led the NFL in target share per game this past season. Almost 35% of Matthew Stafford's targets went in the direction of Cooper Kupp on a per game basis. Absurd. And obviously, Kupp has an argument to be made to potentially be the wide receiver 1 in fantasy yet again this next season. Now, the reason I'm going to go with these other guys ahead of him are twofold. One, Cooper Kupp's just naturally older than a lot of these guys. Kupp's pushing 30. Naturally, at this point of your career, you're assuming that we get a little bit of a slowdown. Obviously, not saying Kupp's going to fall off a cliff. But on top of this, I mean, I'll know I've said this time and time again, I like looking at Las Vegas win totals because I'm an idiot, like I've said a million times now, and Las Vegas sportsbooks know significantly more than I do. So if we're able to look at what they're telling us, I think we can assume a couple different things about NFL teams this next season, and they have the Los Angeles Rams at 6.5 wins this next year. So they're telling us that the Rams are probably going 6-11. They're going 7-10. They're telling us that most likely the Rams are not a good football team this next season, where the Miami Dolphins are actually Super Bowl contenders. So I'm going to give the edge here in this tier to Tyreek Hill. Now, going over to a frustrated, a disgruntled wide receiver with Stefan Diggs in this tier, I'm going to be looking at my most drafted players so far on Underdog in round 1, just simply because, I mean, hell, obviously in Underdog drafts, you have to grab your wide receiver round 1. Everybody else is taking Kelsey. Everybody else is taking CMC over Stefan Diggs. I'm willing to take Stefan Diggs as early as 5 there. Now, of course, if you are drafting in like a casual redraft league where you only start 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end, and a flex, hell no, you're not taking Stefan Diggs over Christian McCaffrey or Travis Kelsey. Very dependent on the platform you're drafting on. And of course, if you want to get into a draft with us today, I mean, we're drafting literally every single day on Underdog Fantasy. They have Best Ball Mania live right now, which is a $25 buy-in, $15 million prize pool. It's best ball, so no time commitment at all during the season. That's how I drafted 700 teams and won $150,000 on Underdog last year. It's also the same place where you see all these player props at the very top of the screen. And when you sign up to Underdog with promo code FLOCK, they're going to match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. With promo code FLOCK, you're also going to get my 2023 fantasy football rankings, as well as a free trial to flockfantasy.com. But yeah, diving into Stefan Diggs, the reason I'm willing to take him very, very often is just the floor and ceiling combo is ridiculous. It's a wide receiver that is still in his prime age window. He has had 3 straight seasons of being a top 10 wide receiver. His target share actually posted its highest mark this past year in Buffalo at 28.5%. He's at 2.6 yards per route run, 107 air yards per game. The only way Stefan Diggs doesn't really work out this next season in my mind is, one, if DeAndre Hopkins goes over to Buffalo. If that happens, oh dear God, I will be crying. And 2, if Stefan Diggs is so disgruntled with what's going on, somehow, some way he gets himself sent out of Buffalo, similar to what he did with Minnesota. Now, what I'm assuming happens and what I'm hoping for happens. So I'm hoping that Stefan Diggs learns to just be happy. Okay, my man, you got a good thing going for you in Buffalo. You have Josh Allen there. You're making a lot of money. So I'm assuming that Diggs is still in a prime spot to be a top 5 wide receiver yet again this next season. Of course, if things change, we'll update these rankings. Now, going over to our next guy, we're going to be looking at CeeDee Lamb at pick 6. Yes, if you're looking at my Underdog rankings, I may have A.J. Brown ahead of CeeDee Lamb because A.J. Brown may have a higher spike week potential, but CeeDee Lamb is the safer bet. CeeDee Lamb is the guy that is actually going out there and being very consistent in terms of his overall volume. And CeeDee Lamb is just on a straight trajectory upwards, right? It doesn't matter what statistic you are looking at. His intended air yards per game going from 70 to 81 to 97. His yards per route run going from 2 to 2.2 to 2.5. His yards per game going from 58 to 68 to 79. His overall wide receiver finish going from 31 to 16 to 7. He's still incredibly young and very similar to what you actually had with Tyreek and what you'll have with Jalen Waddle, who we'll talk about in just 1 second. He did not have his starting quarterback through the entire season. You have to remember, Dak Prescott missed time this past year. And if you're looking at the games that CeeDee Lamb played with versus without Dak Prescott, there's a pretty big difference here. I mean, with Dak Prescott, he averaged about 18.5 fantasy points per game compared to without Dak Prescott, he was at 16.5. The man just scored more touchdowns because the offense was better overall. The man had more receiving yards on fewer targets. So I don't know. I mean, if you get a full season of Dak Prescott in Dallas, CeeDee Lamb, the unquestioned alpha, not too worried about Brandon Cooks coming over. I think it's a great spot. Now, A.J. Brown will be our next guy here. Like I said, maybe for drafting on Underdog where you're looking for spike week options, A.J. Brown's a little more appealing, but this is just for regular PPR leagues, these rankings. And if we're looking at A.J. Brown, super consistent guy, right? 3 straight seasons, 2.7 yards per route run or higher. That tells us he's an elite level wide receiver, averaging almost 110 air yards per game. Now, you're not going to get the same level of targets from A.J. Brown that you should expect with CeeDee Lamb, which is why CeeDee Lamb may be a more consistent option in a full PPR format, but the offense is going to be significantly better in Philadelphia with A.J. Brown, which is why you may have more touchdown spikes and more volatility overall. Now, going over to our next wide receiver, I know a lot of people will not have him in this tier, but I'm going to go ahead and take Davante Adams here. Now, I tweeted this out the other day, but I think it's very useful to be looking at the player props they have out there on Underdog right now, because, I mean, these props are out there that anybody can go through and take them, right? If Underdog puts out some crappy projections and some crappy props, you can go take them up on it, and if Underdog's wrong, you can win a lot of money. Now, I'm telling you right now, Underdog's probably not going to be wrong. They probably know more than you and know more than me with these projections, but nonetheless, if we look at how they have these wide receivers, they have Justin Jefferson, 1. They have Cooper Kupp 2. Then they have Davante Adams at 3 with his season-long receiving yards. Now, of course, I'm not following these projections one for one with these rankings. If I was, Davante Adams would be a top 3 wide receiver this next season. I do think that there are still some concerns regarding the quarterback situation with the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, to be fair, I don't necessarily think Derek Carr was a phenomenal option this past season. And if you are going to look at Davante Adams as a wide receiver that just dominates targets, I mean, if we're looking over the past 3 seasons now, Davante Adams, 10.5 targets per game, 10.5 targets per game, 10.6 targets per game. I mean, the man is the only wide receiver over the past 3 years to average over 10 targets per game each and every season. Now, he's a little bit older as well, which is why we're going to have some of these younger options ahead of him. Like, you're kind of seeing the decline with his yards per route run going from 3.2 to 2.9 to 2.5. Nonetheless, elite level wide receiver. I'll be super happy to draft him every chance I get. Now, dropping down to our next tier, we're going to have Garrett Wilson here. And with Garrett Wilson, if you're looking at the season-long stats, they're going to be very skewed, right? I mean, if you're looking at this little box, wide receiver 31 as a rookie, who the hell cares? I mean, he only had 65 receiving yards per game. He barely scored any touchdowns, only 1.9 yards per route run. But it was a tale of 2 seasons here for Garrett Wilson. If you're going to go through and look at games where Zach Wilson played, Garrett Wilson averaged 8.8 points per game. Garrett Wilson averaged fewer than 50 receiving yards on a per game basis. He averaged 6 targets per game. Now, I've done the in-depth research, so you don't have to waste your time with this. Trust me, I've grinded the tape. I've looked at all the numbers, and the conclusion that we have is Zach Wilson was a bad quarterback this past season, just in case you didn't know. Because if we're looking at games where Garrett Wilson played without Zach Wilson, he averaged 17.5 fantasy points per game. Like, I tweeted this out a couple days ago, but Garrett Wilson's 2022 season with Zach Wilson, he was the wide receiver 60 from a points per game basis. Without Zach Wilson, he was the wide receiver 8 from a points per game perspective. Now you insert Aaron Rodgers. It's pretty safe to have him as a top 10 option this next year, even if he was just the wide receiver 31 last season. Now we're going to go Amon-Ra St. Brown at 10. With St. Brown, I think you can make an argument that maybe if your league's very active with trading, right, and you think that Amon-Ra St. Brown's going to start off the year red hot with no Jameson Williams, that you should draft Amon-Ra St. Brown, then possibly look to sell him high after a few weeks and then go get Garrett Wilson plus. Maybe you can make that argument. I'm not going to mess around with it. I mean, with Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver that ended his rookie season in a spectacular way. Then he goes into year 2. He's the wide receiver 10 from a points per game perspective. Now, what's interesting with St. Brown is I think he will be a much better full PPR option than like a half PPR best ball option. So if you're in your casual redraft league, I actually really like drafting Amon-Ra St. Brown. I mean, he had a 26% team target share this past season, 2.5 yards per route run. But if you're in like an underdog draft, right, where it's more so best ball, so you're looking for spike weeks and half PPR, there I maybe would have him a tier below Garrett Wilson just because he doesn't really go downfield, right? I mean, 54 intended air yards per game this past season. He's the wide receiver that's operating closer to the line of scrimmage. And for this reason, you actually saw Amon-Ra St. Brown be a lot better post TJ Hawkinson trade. If you're looking at games without TJ Hawkinson this past season, Amon-Ra St. Brown went out there and averaged 83 receiving yards on a per game basis. Games with TJ Hawkinson, Amon-Ra St. Brown actually only averaged 58 receiving yards per game. So, I mean, that's a bullish sign for St. Brown. Now, going over to our next tier, we're going to be looking at Jalen Waddle here at 11. Obviously, if something happens with Tyreek, Waddle will move up these rankings in a dramatic way. Waddle's season this past year was one fueled off of efficiency instead of volume. Trust me, I think Waddle is an elite level talent. Y'all know, I mean, Jalen Waddle was my most drafted wide receiver in fantasy last season, but that's when we were getting him in round 4. Now you're having to take him in round 2. It's going to be way more difficult. And if you're looking at Jalen Waddle this past season, like we were discussing, the target share actually went down with the addition of Tyreek Hill. He went from seeing about 24% of his team's targets on a per game basis down to 20%. Now, he was just much more efficient with these targets, right? 2.7 yards per route run, 6.8% touchdown rate. I'm a little bit worried the efficiency may come down just a bit. Obviously, I'd rather chase volume. But what you actually have is a massive benefit for Jalen Waddle this next year is the splits with and without Tua. With Tua, he's out there averaging 85 receiving yards per game. Without Tua, 62. Tua makes this offense run, okay? Tua is a great quarterback. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Getting Tua back in here is going to allow both Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle continue to dominate in fantasy. Now, at 12, we're going to have Chris Olave. I mean, we've talked a lot about Chris Olave, right? I mean, this is a wide receiver that we were drafting a lot back when we used to get him in the end of the second round of underdog drafts. If you're in your casual redraft league, I'm probably going to be looking for Chris Olave in the third round. However, I mean, as a rookie, the efficiency wasn't there. He barely scored touchdowns, which was gross. Obviously, you'd rather touchdowns be there, but that's going to be extremely volatile. That may come back this next season. He did have 2.5 yards per route run, 122 air yards per game. I'm not a big Derek Carr guy, but Derek Carr is probably better than 33-year-old Andy Dalton was this past season. Yeah, I think you can be excited about Olave, but I think that's all I have for y'all. Again, thank you so much for checking out this video. If you have not done so already, you better go down there, drop a like, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. And of course, if you want to get in a fantasy football draft with me today, you can on Underdog Fantasy. The link's down there in the description, the link's in the comment section. Same place where you see all those player props. When you sign up with promo code FLOCK, they're going to match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. Going to get my 2023 fantasy football rankings as well as a free trial to flockfantasy.com. But thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. Really appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day and really hope that we get to see you in the live stream later today.